Hi, I'm your host, Sid Yanamandra, CEO of Entrada, and I'm excited to welcome you to this installment of Wealth Solutions Report, Tales from the Cyber Crypt. As you know, in these videos, we cover some of the most common cybersecurity related issues that are truly out of this world and lessons we can all learn from them. So today, I'm super excited to have a distinguished guest and cybersecurity expert, Dr. Neil Daswani. He's joining us today. Dr. Neil Daswani is the co-director of Stanford's Advanced Cybersecurity Education Program. He has a PhD from Stanford, ex-Googler, co-founder of Dacient, which was acquired by Twitter, and then joined LifeLock as the Chief Information Security Officer. LifeLock was acquired by Symantec, so he served as the Chief Information Security Officer of the Consumer Business Unit within Symantec. Now, Neil has written 2 books in cybersecurity, and his most recent book is called Big Breaches. So I'm super excited to have Neil join us today. Neil, tell us a little bit about the latest book and what's it about?
Sure. So first of all, Sid, thank you for having me. Let me tell you a little bit about Big Breaches, Cybersecurity Lessons for Everyone, which is the most recent book that I co-authored and published this past March. The first half of the book talks about the histories and the stories of some of the biggest breaches of our time, going back to the Target breach from 2013, covering the JP Morgan Chase breach in 2014, covering the Office of Personnel Management breach in 2015, on and on and on. We cover a number of the Facebook incidents, hacks, and breaches. We cover the Capital One breach, which was the largest cloud security breach of all time. And so that's pretty much the first half of the book. You get to hear about how those breaches happened and how they could have been prevented. And then the second half of the book offers a roadmap to recovery, pretty much for any organization that does not want to become the next mega breach of the month, starting with what are the right habits you need to instill in your organization to achieve security, going on to talking about what you need to do at the level of the board of directors, as well as what you need to do in terms of deploying technology countermeasures in addition to people and process countermeasures. So that's a little bit about the book. And then it kind of ends with, if you're interested in entering the field of cybersecurity, it gives some guidance for how you can join the party here and help us prevent big breaches from happening in the future.
So Dr. Daswani, in your experience, right, like you've been through so many different environments, worked for so many successful organizations, what is a memorable sort of cybersecurity story that comes to mind? Maybe a story where you saw an organization suffer, a breach, or maybe there was an incident that could have been a breach if it wasn't prevented. I mean, if you kind of dig back into the annals of history, what jumps out at you?
Sure. So I'm happy to talk about a past incident. As we all know, in the field of security, a lot of things that happen when there's security incidents have to stay internal and are proprietary and whatnot. But let me talk about one of the most interesting incidents that occurred back when I was at Google. So in mid-May 2006, I happened to be monitoring a piece of malware, and so I had an interest in how Google was, of course, making its money. It was making billions of dollars from its ads, and most of the security folks at Google were focusing on cross-site scripting and SQL injection and a whole variety of vulnerabilities. But I had this hypothesis that at some point there's going to be a piece of malware that is going to start targeting Google's ad network, and so there were only a few malware samples at the time that were doing such things in the ad space in general. But in mid-May 2006, there was a particular piece of malware called Clickbot A, the first such named Clickbot. It was named by Panda Labs. And a colleague of mine at Google, Eric Davis, he got a sample of it, and I started running it in a lab, and that I was just kind of running at home. And in mid-May 2006, that particular piece of malware was only maybe on a few hundred machines on the internet, and it had not demonstrated any history of clicking on Google Ads. But just 1 month later, in June 2006, there were 2 things that I saw in the lab. One was it had gotten distributed out onto over 100,000 machines from a bunch of threat feeds and threat data. And then secondly, it clicked on a Google AdSense ad. So the natural question that we had at Google was, okay, it's 2 weeks before the end of the quarter, and there's this piece of malware on over 100,000 machines clicking that demonstrated that it has a capability to click on Google Ads. Like, what revenue should Google not take credit for
Right.
when it puts out its Q2 earnings report?
Right.
And at the time, I didn't know the answer. I don't think anyone knew the answer, and we of course took that up the chain. We said, though, if you give us 2 weeks, we'll find the answer. So there was a 2-week period where I had worked together and helped coordinate the activities of about 35 engineers across the company that were focused on getting the answer on this question. I think I maybe slept maybe 3 or 4 hours a night for that 2 straight weeks. At the end of the day, what we found was that the revenue impact to Google was almost negligible. It was $50,000. And Google, of course, is a multi-billion-dollar company. And so the big learning that came from that incident was, while Google had already invested in a whole bunch of defenses, a whole bunch of automated defenses against click fraud, that was mostly taking place by humans and third world countries and whatnot, we felt we needed more automated defenses against malware, like clickbots that were going to conduct such attacks. And so there were 3 particular ideas and initiatives that I had to bring more automation specifically to identify malware that might be impacting not only Google's ad systems, but a whole bunch of other systems at Google. And I pretty much made the shift from being a senior security engineer to becoming a security product manager at Google, and helped find technical leads for those 3 projects. And we put in place more automated defenses to defend Google's advertisers against such things. We published a paper about it called The Anatomy of Clickbot A at Usenix Hotbots in 2007. And we basically wanted to educate the larger field and more companies that were in the advertising business about these kinds of threats. So I hope that's at least one.
Yeah,
one
no, that's great. I mean, I don't think many people can say that they saved Google a bunch of money from from preventing them from being prey to malware attacks. I mean, that's a big statement, Sunil. Amazing, right?
So I was just very, very lucky at the time to be in the right time at the right place, focus on looking at the right things, and I was glad that I was able to help Google. Let me just say, though, that that there were very, very many smart people at Google. The 35 engineers that worked on that, kudos to them for really doing all the great investigation. And I was just glad to be able to help coordinate the activities and help get an answer to Google's executives.
So speaking of malware, Neil, I mean, we're now reading about ransomware attacks, constantly in the news, right? Why do you think we are seeing more ransomware attacks now than before? What's changed?
I think one of the reasons that ransomware attacks have been growing in quote unquote popularity is because it is now becoming one of the most effective ways as a cyber criminal to, if you're a cyber criminal and you want to monetize your ability to distribute malware, it has been a great way for them to monetize because more and more companies have been paying larger and larger ransoms, and it's just a great way for the cyber criminals to make money. If we look at, for instance, the Colonial Oil Pipeline, which was hit by a ransomware attack just a couple months ago, they paid out approximately $5 million in ransom because, not only Colonial Oil Pipeline, but a whole bunch of companies don't have the appropriate anti-malware defenses in place. They sometimes don't also have enough backups in place. And because of the lack of countermeasures deployed, it is relatively easy for these cyber criminals to basically demand a ransom and have those ransoms paid. Now, in the Colonial Oil Pipeline case, you did have a whole bunch of authorities that went after the Bitcoin that was paid to the cyber criminals, but they clearly can't do that for each and every ransomware attack. And I think that's one of the reasons why ransomware attacks have been growing in popularity in the cyber criminal community.
So, our audience is primarily in the wealth management space, right? So many of them are independent firms, right? Their asset managers are dealing with a lot of money of their clients, right? They're offering wealth advice. And then we also see a lot of enterprises that have a large network of advisors or reps that are affiliated with them. What recommendations would you give, a growing organization, let's say a 20-person shop, in terms of what they need to be doing in terms of cybersecurity to prevent the next big breach? What do you also recommend some of the larger enterprises that are managing those, a large network of these smaller firms? What do you recommend to them that they do in order to prevent, the next big breach?
Sure, I'd be happy to provide some recommendations both for the smaller as well as the larger organizations. And let me first mention that wealth managers are, by the nature of their business, of course, managing significant amount of assets.
Yep.
So there isn't any reason that they're not going to be a significant target for ransomware, as well as a whole bunch of other types of attacks. Now, for the smaller organizations, one of the things that we did in the Big Breaches book is we analyzed what are the root causes that all these breaches have been taking place. And the good news for smaller organizations, for larger organizations, they have to comply with all kinds of standards, and they have to, check hundreds of compliance checkboxes to achieve compliance. Now, for the smaller organizations, the kind of good news here is that, wow, checking hundreds of checkboxes can be a lot of work, right? The good news is that from our investigation, we found that there's only 6 technical root causes of breach. They are phishing and account takeover, malware, software vulnerabilities, unencrypted data, third-party compromise and abuse, sometimes also called supply chain attacks, and finally, inadvertent employee mistakes that are separate from phishing. Phishing is such a large category of inadvertent employee mistakes that it deserves its own category. And so the advice that I'd give to the smaller organizations is that, look, if you've got to figure out where you're going to focus, where you're going to double down your bets, where you're going to put your most strongly effective countermeasures in place, focus on those 6 technical root causes of breach. And you will have drastically mitigated the probability that you can have your wealth management advisors get breached. For the larger organizations, I would say, in addition to focusing on countermeasures for those 6 technical root causes of breach, I would encourage them to make sure that they are compliant. Let me mention that most organizations that have been breached have actually been compliant at the time of breach. So that begs the question, how is compliance helping? It is helping a lot. It is helping a lot of organizations establish the security hygiene that they need. But if you get breached and you are not compliant, then all kinds of bad things will rain upon you. You could imagine that your legal liability will be astronomically higher if you get breached and you're not compliant, as compared to if you get breached and you are at least compliant and demonstrating the right security hygiene. So to summarize, for the smaller organizations, focus on the technical root causes of breach. For the larger organizations, do that as well, but also make sure that you are compliant. It'll help you avoid getting breached if you focus on the root causes and are compliant. And if, God forbid, you still get breached, your legal liability may be less if you can at least demonstrate that you're being compliant. If there's some super sophisticated attacker that comes after you, that is a different story than if you got hit by a run-of-the-mill ransomware attack.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Neil, for joining us today. This was very informative. Hope you all enjoyed it. This concludes this episode of the Wealth Solutions Report. Join me next time for another interesting discussion about cyber breaches and potential liabilities that organizations might be facing out there. Once again, thanks a lot, Neil.
Thank you, Sid, for having me once again. Look forward to staying in close touch.